Hello, Sunday School teachers, preachers, and students. Welcome to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. This week, I review God's provision for the Israelites as they begin their journey in the wilderness. God is faithful during uncertainty while providing the Israelites bread from heaven. About 45 days after they begin their journey, they complained bitterly to Moses and Aaron and blamed the two brothers for bringing them into the wilderness to die. There are no soldiers chasing them, no slave masters whipping them, and no Pharaohs enslaving them. Yet they complain and wish they were back in Egypt because they're hungry. Had they forgotten how God miraculously delivered them from Pharaoh and his enslavement with mighty works and wonders? They had given up, capitulated, and thrown in the towel because at least in Egypt they had food to eat. Now they blame Moses and Aaron for their hunger. They blame Moses and Aaron, saying, "You have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Once again, God is faithful by providing quails in the evening and manna in the morning for the Israelites to eat. God provides their daily bread. Likewise, it's important for us to know that just as God provided what the Israelites needed, God can do the same for us today. As we continue to understand how God is faithful, this week I focus on the miraculous provision of God for the people of God. Some of the ideas surrounding this week's text include the terms manna and Sabbath. Now, if you have Wi-Fi in your church, Sunday school classroom, or wherever you share this lesson, this channel is a good way to teach and discuss this week's lesson. With Wi-Fi, you can start and stop the lesson when and where you want to for discussion. What I provide is a concise overview of background, context, characters, themes, and topics that gets to the point, saves you time, and enhances your own teaching and study. If that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. But the only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. So please subscribe, like, comment, and then click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. So with that said, welcome again to SundaySchoolPreacher.com, and let's go to work. First, we'll look at the background for today's text. Exodus is the second book of the Old Testament. It tells the story of the origin of the Israelite nation. Like its name says, it tells the story of the Exodus of the Hebrew people from their enslavement of Egypt. But it's not just any departure. It's a miraculous deliverance and redemption by God for God's people. Nelson's Bible Handbook explains that the Bible's entire message of redemption grows out of the covenant relationship between God and God's people first described in this book. So in Exodus, redemption is the central message, and this becomes the central theme throughout all of Christian scripture. Many of the other themes in Exodus can also be found in the New Testament Gospels. For example, Moses received the law on Mount Sinai, and Jesus delivered the Sermon on the Mount. Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness to give life to the people, and Jesus was lifted up on the cross to bring eternal life to all who trust him. And the Passover served as a base on which Jesus developed the Last Supper. So in these ways, there are themes in Exodus that are repeated in the gospel record. In these ways and others, the book of Exodus is central to both Jewish and Christian religions. The New Interpreter Study Bible explains that Exodus begins with a narration of the conflict between the Lord and Pharaoh over Israel's fate. It's an epic conflict between kings and God. The weapons of war are the forces of nature. The Lord summons reptiles, insects, and meteorological phenomena, including hail and darkness, in an assault on Pharaoh. Exodus ends with the Lord finally descending from Mount Sinai to enter the completed tabernacle on New Year's Day. Exodus, the 40th chapter, verses 1, 2, and 7. When the Lord enters the completed tabernacle on New Year's Day, the Lord fills the sanctuary with fire and smoke. Chapter 16 of Exodus deals with God's provision for the Israelites. After about 45 days in the wilderness, the Israelites complain bitterly to Moses and Aaron. They complain because they're hungry. God provides meat in the evening and bread from heaven in the morning for them to eat. This manna from heaven is just one way God is faithful during uncertainty to this nation now wandering in the wilderness. Some important words to consider include manna and Sabbath. So let's review last week and see how it connects to this week. Last week's lesson was taken from 1 Samuel, the 1st chapter, verses 9 through 20. As the lesson opens, Hannah, along with her husband Elkanah and Elkanah's other wife, Peninnah, are gathered at the temple in Shiloh. After eating and drinking, Hannah arose and presented herself before the Lord to pray. I noted that in verse 10, Hannah was deeply distressed and she prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. She's a woman without a child in a society that values women who have sons. Hannah weeps bitterly because not only is she childless, but Peninnah, her husband's other wife, was her rival and provoked her severely to irritate her. I noted how Dr. Theodore W. Berg in the Africana Bible explains that Hannah's antagonistic rival torments her with vicious barbs and taunts. Hannah is caught in the midst of what could be understood in contemporary street vernacular as baby mama drama. I also discussed a reference from Townsend commentary explaining that ancient Eastern legal texts allowed an infertile wife to provide her husband, her maidservant, to bear children for her as his heir. Therefore, the principal wife may possess legal rights to the children of her servants. Now, if you can't imagine what that looks like, you can watch a few episodes of The Handmaid's Tale. The Handmaid's Tale depicts an example of what one wife owning the child of an enslaved woman looks like. This, however, was not the desire of Hannah's heart. Hannah desired a man-child birthed from her own body. Hannah is distressed, she's distraught, and she's ready for her circumstances in life to change. She was tired of being picked on and talked about. She was tired of being laughed at and scorned. Even though her husband loved her, she was tired of being treated badly about something for which she had no control. She had no child of her own, and there was nothing she could do about it. Last week I referenced Dr. Theodore W. Berg in the Africana Bible, and Dr. Berg explains, Hannah feels the pressure of the high value her society placed on bearing a child, particularly a male, in order to confirm her womanhood. She prays diligently to her God, asking to become pregnant. In verse 11, Hannah made a vow. She vowed to God that if God would remember her with a man-child, she'll give him back to God as a Nazirite until the day of his death. Elkanah loves Hannah, despite the Lord having closed her womb. And now Hannah believes this is something that only God can fix. She made a bargain with God. If only God will bless her with a man-child, she'll give the child back to God as a Nazirite. I referenced Westminster Dictionary of Theological Terms defining vow as that which one has promised, particularly to God or to other persons, that binds one to them. And as much as Hannah wanted a child of her own, she promised God she would return the child to God if only God remembered her with this blessing. I explained that we can look upon Hannah's vow with compassion and understanding as a powerless woman desperately designed to change her circumstances. However, there are numerous other uses of vows throughout Scripture that we can look at both favorably and unfavorably. Jonah makes a vow inside the great fish. Jezebel vows to kill Elijah. Jacob vows at Bethel if God will keep him that he'll serve God. And in Acts 23:12, certain Jews vow to kill Paul. I also noted that Hannah's vow was specific. Hannah vowed to give God a Nazirite. Westminster defines a Nazirite as a member of a group of Israelites who vowed abstinence from eating or drinking the fruit of the vine, who let their hair grow long, and who sought to avoid contact with dead bodies. And this was a way of expressing their devotion to God. Hannah's child will be special. Hannah's child will serve God in a specific way. This child will be set apart for service to God. Hannah, like many parents today, wanted her child to make a difference in the world. I also referenced Dr. Theodore Berg again, explaining in the Africana Bible that a Nazirite was a male or female who dedicated himself or herself, or who was dedicated to Yahweh by others through specific vows. In verses 12, 13, and 14, Hannah continued praying silently with only her lips moving. Eli the high priest notices her, and he thinks she's drunk. Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine." I noted the NISB explaining that Eli's first speech shows his inability, unexpected in a priest, to distinguish between prayer and drunkenness. He could not distinguish between the sincere prayer of a powerless woman and the antics of someone drunk with wine. And perhaps there are ways in our own lives that we mistake someone's sincerity for what we see as playful antics. In verses 15 and 16, Hannah sets the record straight. Hannah tells Eli she hasn't been drinking. She's been pouring out her soul before the Lord. She informs Eli that she has been speaking out of great anxiety and vexation all this time. After having set the record straight, verses 17 and 18 show Eli is at least an understanding priest. Now he recognizes Hannah's pain and distress. Now he sees her for the woman she is, and he tells her to go in peace. The God of Israel grant you the petition you've made to God. I thought it was important to note that so many people have been in Hannah's situation, unable to do anything about their circumstances, knowing that only God can work it out. After hearing the man of God tell Hannah to go in peace, her soul was no longer troubled. Hannah had a calm assurance that somehow God was going to work it out. She left her place of prayer, went to her quarters, ate and drank with her husband, and she was no longer sad. Verses 19 and 20 closed last week's lesson with Hannah and the others rising the next morning, worshiping God, and then traveling back to their homes in Ramah. At some point, Elkanah had sex with Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. Hannah conceived the son she wanted so desperately and named him Samuel. Verse 20 says, she named him Samuel, for she said, I have asked him of the Lord. Hannah got an affirmative answer to her prayer. The birth of Samuel changed her life and her circumstances. This week's lesson continues with the theme of God's faithfulness. This time, God is faithful to a grumbling and complaining people. God is faithful by providing both bread from heaven and meat from heaven to a hungry people now wandering in the wilderness. Like Hannah, the people are in distress and distraught. But unlike Hannah, they look to Moses and Aaron with complaints instead of trusting God to provide. This week we see God's provision despite the acts and conduct of the Israelites. They have completely given up, thrown in the towel, and concluded that all hope is lost. But as God often does for the Israelites and for us today, God makes a way out of no way. The lesson this week is entitled Faithful During Uncertainty and Bread from Heaven. The scripture text comes from Exodus, the 16th chapter, verses 1 through 8, and then skips to verses 13 through 15. I'll read that text for you now from the New Revised Standard Version. We begin with the section entitled Bread from Heaven. The whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim. And Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month, after they had departed from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Then the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your complaining against the Lord. For what are we that you complain against us? And Moses said, when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord has heard the complaining that you utter against him, what are we? Your complaining is not against us, but against the Lord. And then we skip down to verse 15. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, it is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you needs, an omer to a person according to the number of persons, all providing for those in their own tents. So what takes place in this passage? The lesson opens at verse 1 with the Israelites already delivered from their enslavement in Egypt. They're now wandering in the wilderness at a place called Sin between Elim and Sinai. They've been on their journey from Egypt for about 45 days. In verses 2 and 3, the whole congregation complained against Moses and Aaron. But it wasn't just a complaint. They protest so severely that they imagined dying back in the land of their captivity. They complained, if only they had died by the hand of the Lord back in Egypt. These are a people who have given up. There were no Egyptians around to enslave them. There are no slave masters around to whip them. There are no Egyptian soldiers around to slay them. Yet they desire to go back to the land of enslavement, back to whippings and beatings, and back to soldiers who could slay them. They've given up, capitulated, and thrown in the towel because at least in Egypt they had food to eat. Now they see themselves in this foreign land, this wilderness, dying of hunger. So now they blame Moses and Aaron for their hunger. They blame Moses and Aaron, saying, you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. The New Interpreter Study Bible explains that life as a slave in Egypt is better than the risk of freedom in the wilderness. In verse 4, the Lord gives Moses a plan. The Lord tells Moses how bread will be provided and how the people are to gather the bread from heaven. But the Lord presents this as a test for the Israelites. God will rain bread from heaven, and the Israelites are to gather only enough for their daily needs. And in this way, God will know if they'll follow God's instruction. Just as God gave the Israelites provision day by day, it's up to us to trust God for our daily bread. Verse 5 gives them some instructions on how to gather in preparation for the Sabbath. On the 6th day, they're to gather twice as much in preparation for the 7th day of rest. Townsend commentary explains that the Sabbath was stressed in the giving of manna, though the law had not yet been given. The NISB notes that the priestly writer, we talked about that several weeks ago, the priestly writer first prescribes the Sabbath rest in the story of creation. That's Genesis, the 2nd chapter, verses 1 through 3. And then the priestly writer reiterates it here in the middle of, in the miracle of manna and in the revelation of the Decalogue. That's Exodus, the 20th chapter, verse 8 through 11. In verses 6 and 7, Moses and Aaron explain to the Israelites the plan that the Lord has set forth for their provision. They tell the people, in the evening, you'll know that it was the Lord that brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning, you'll see the glory of God. Moses and Aaron want them to know that they aren't complaining to them, but to God. The NISB explains that just as the plagues were signs for Pharaoh and the Egyptians to come to knowledge of the Lord, so also the manna from heaven is intended to bring the Israelites to the knowledge of the Lord as the God who brought them out of Egypt. In verse 8, Moses makes it plain that the people aren't complaining against him and Aaron. They're complaining against the Lord. And this won't be the last time the Israelites complain. They've seen They've seen the great plagues and experienced the great deliverance of God from the Egyptian enslavers. Yet a mere 45 days later, they're completely defeated with no enemy soldiers in sight. The text skips to verses 13 through 15. And here the Lord provides quail in the evening, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. After the dew lifted, there was a fine, flaky substance on the ground, and they asked, "What is it?" And Moses explains, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." The New Interpreter Study Bible notes that the word manna is a Hebrew pun. What is really man, is it is really hu. But the Hebrew phrase man hu can also be translated as it is manna, supplying also an answer to the question and a name for the food. So let's give the text some context. This text helps us understand that it can be hard to trust God when our stomachs are empty. When our basic needs aren't met, it's easy to do as the Israelites did and blame whoever you can. There were hundreds of thousands of Israelites in the wilderness. They were hungry in a foreign land, and there seemed to be no hope of feeding all of this massive crowd. After all, they were in the wilderness. But that's the thing about God. God brought them to the wilderness, and God would see them through the wilderness. And I suppose that there are times in our lives when we too are faced with wilderness experiences. The problem seems so big. We're in the foreign land of not having no control over our circumstances. The situation seems dire and desperate. Beloved, God brought you to it, and God will see you through it. Just as God gave them instructions for their daily bread, we too should just follow the instructions. Key characters in the text. Of course, Moses is a key character. Moses, a good definition for Moses, is the first great leader of the Hebrew people, regarded by some as the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Moses is revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims for his daring leadership and diplomacy, as well as his promulgation of the divine law. That's a quote from Townsend. Aaron is also a key character in the text. Aaron is the brother of Moses and the first high priest of Israel. Aaron was a descendant of Levi's and a son of Amram and Jochebed. Born 83 years before the Exodus, he was 3 years older than Moses. You can see Exodus 7th chapter 7th verse. But he's younger than their sister Miriam. Also a quote from Townsend. Keywords, not necessarily in the text, but good for discussion. Manna is a key word, and manna is defined as food from heaven, providentially provided by God for Israel in the wilderness. It's used in the New Testament as a type or foreshadowing of Jesus Christ as the living bread from heaven. John the 6th chapter 31 through 65, and in the Lord's Supper, 1 Corinthians 10:3. Sabbath is a key word. It can be defined as the 7th day of the week, set apart for worship and rest. It's a holy day in Judaism. Christian practice has been to observe Sunday as a day of worship in celebration of Christ's resurrection. Themes, topics, discussion, or sermon preparation ideas. One theme might be our daily bread. Of course, you've probably heard of the daily commentary or the daily devotion called Our Daily Bread, and you can work with that in several different ways. A second one might be follow the instructions to pass the test. Of course, God gave instructions to Moses, and God used that as a test. Questions you might ask your listeners. The Israelites had been in the wilderness journey for about 45 days. They were in an unfamiliar place without food and had already struggled for water. Discuss other ways they could have responded instead of murmuring to Moses and Aaron. Another question might be, discuss potential ways people are in bondage today and willingly remain in bondage instead of seeking freedom. And then a concluding thought. This quote from the NISB, it sits heavy with me. Life as a slave in Egypt was better than the risk of freedom in the wilderness. How many ways do we accept life as a slave in Egypt? A preview for next week's lesson. Next week, the lesson comes from the book of Numbers. And as we continue the God is faithful theme, we see yet again the Israelites grumbling and complaining against Moses and Aaron, saying, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Again, the Israelites are faithless, complaining, and murmuring. Next week, we see how the Israelites had to be reminded of who God really is. This time, it's Joshua and Caleb who provide the minority report among the spies that the promised land can be theirs. The lesson is entitled, God Hears Our Cry. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I am Reverend Dexter Alexander, and you've been listening to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. The only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. Please also click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. And if you don't mind, please share this site with other Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Thank you, and may God bless you real good.